Morning. I'm going to call this hearing of the Senate Budget Committee to order and welcome my distinguished ranking member, Senator Grassley. We're going to begin with opening remarks by myself and then Ranking Member Grassley and then Senator Graham, at whose request this hearing is taking place. So let me start by thanking Senator Graham and his staff for their partnership on today's hearing, and thank Ranking Member Grassley for his blessing of this effort. Today's bipartisan hearing looks at transitioning away from fossil fuels, in my view, an economic, national security, and climate imperative, in a way that effectively seizes opportunities and addresses challenges. The auto industry is a major economic engine, as Senator Stabenow, who is here, will be the first to argue. In 2023, the global auto market was valued at $4 trillion, of which the U.S. accounted for a bit less than 17%. Two U.S. automakers, Ford and GM, are among the world's 5 largest automakers. Foreign companies operate assembly plants in the U.S. Senator Graham is attentive to the BMW plant that operates in his home state. Whenever we go do the Munich Security Conference, he's sure to check in with the BMW folks to make sure they keep building in South Carolina. Motor vehicles and parts were America's second largest export, and the auto market could increase to over $6 trillion by 2031. So we want to be a part of that action. To grow U.S. auto workers' share of this growing pie, we need to understand and respond to this global market. So here's where we are. Globally, 20% of vehicles sold in 2023 around the world were electric, 20%. In China, which is the world's largest auto market, 33% of cars were electric. In Europe, 20% of vehicles sold were electric. And other major markets are racing to EVs. Between 2022 and 2023, electric car sales tripled in Brazil and more than quadrupled in Thailand. And I'd put into the record a article from the New York Times, which I've just now misplaced, but that points out how the Thai auto market has been lost to Japanese manufacturing, which used to control it, because they aren't producing the electric vehicles that the Thai market demands. So you got to have the vehicles people want to meet the market. Here it is. Thank you. Without objection, I will add that to the record. The writing is on the wall for us. Around the world, the future of personal transportation is electric, completely independent of whatever the United States decides to do. And that's great. First, it means more freedom from a global commodity whose price is manipulated by international petro-dictators. Over and over, American consumers suffer as the geopolitical designs of petro-dictators cause oil prices to soar. Real energy independence comes from independence from fossil fuel cartels. Going electric benefits Western democracies as oil and gas revenues fund many of our worst foreign adversaries. Look no further than the corrupt petro-tyrant Vladimir Putin. As we reduce our dependence on oil and gas, we diminish our foreign adversaries' ability to bully and corrupt. Senator Graham and I wrote in a 2021 op-ed published in Time magazine, if you could wave a magic wand and transition the world away from fossil fuels, Americans would instantly be safer. And without objection, I ask that that be made a part of the record. As the driver and owner of 2 Chevy Bolts, I'll also add, they're just better cars. They're quieter, faster, and more fun to drive. They don't have tailpipe emissions stinking up highways and neighborhoods. Repair and maintenance costs are nearly non-existent. No oil changes, 1/10 the number of parts to break or fail, no expensive, dangerous, smelly gasoline. In emergencies, EV fleets can even provide backup power to families when the grid goes down. And smart EV chargers can help shave dangerous load peaks for electric utilities if we make the needed small investments in the required infrastructure. And of course, yes, electric vehicles dramatically reduce carbon pollution in the transportation sector, currently the largest source of fossil fuel emissions in the U.S. The more we reduce carbon pollution, the better our chances of avoiding the dire systemic climate-related economic risks we've discussed in this committee over the last 18 months. It may be too late to save Florida's property insurance market, but there are plenty of other risks we'd be wise to avoid and fools to stumble into. Electrifying the transportation sector presents a tremendous economic opportunity. Automakers get the message that people want EVs, and they are responding. Since 2017, they have, along with their battery partners, invested $125 billion in electrification. 20 states have or will have EV production or assembly of battery facilities. For some reason, Tesla's taking a hit, but other makers are seeing surging sales year over year. Ford EV sales increased 86% from the first quarter of 2023 to the first quarter of 2024. Rivian sales jumped 59% over the same period. So how do we position our auto industry and our nation for that economic opportunity and for global competitiveness? As our economy electrifies, it needs to be supported by a 21st, not a 20th century grid. The grid will need to handle increased demand from electric vehicles, from heating and cooling, from manufacturing, from hydrogen electrolyzing, and from energy-gobbling data centers. To meet this demand with clean power requires new and upgraded transmission to deliver that power to consumers. That means smart reforms to our cumbersome and antiquated permitting process. Domestic supply chain investments must accelerate. Look at China. 15 years ago, China saw the value of electric vehicles and batteries and began investing. And now it dominates critical mineral and battery manufacturing markets. Let's learn the servitude lessons from our fossil fuel dependence and from our lost manufacturing capacity. Let's swiftly counter this emerging geopolitical risk with smart investment and take back our economic dominance in clean energy products. We must also find a way to reconcile the surging EV market with the Highway Trust Fund that provides 80% of federal highway spending, with a majority of its revenue from federal gas taxes. The bipartisan infrastructure law, which most recently replenished the fund, sunsets in just 2 years. The clock is ticking on highway infrastructure funding. To my mind, this is a morning in America moment. Freedom from dependence on petro-dictators. Opportunity to reclaim from China clean energy leadership. Better, safer products for American consumers with more money in their pockets. Cleaner air to breathe along highways and neighborhood streets. And an important step forward on our pathway to climate safety. What's not to love if we do this right? Thank you again to Senator Graham for this hearing. I look forward to the conversation, and I turn now to Senator Grassley, followed by Senator Graham for opening statements.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome to our expert witnesses. Our last hearing was with CBO Director Schwegel. He was welcome, a very welcoming event at this committee, and unfortunately a rare opportunity for this committee to focus on critical broken budget process. It gives us a chance to talk to somebody that knows that that process needs to be fixed, and a primary responsibility of this committee. In exchange for holding a CBO hearing at my request, I agreed to Senator Graham working with Chairman Whitehouse to put together today's hearing. We'll be discussing electric vehicles and barriers to the electrification of America's light-duty fleet, the Biden-Harris administration's unattainable goal of 50% new EV sales by 2030 has been on full display over the last 4 years. From the imposing expensive EPA regulations to doling out billions in EV subsidies for the rich, the economic detriment to the EV policy, to America's EV policy, is quite evident. Now, I don't want to give the wrong impression. EV technology is impressive and works well for some, but Iowans know that there are far more challenges to EV adoption that many care to admit. EVs best serve wealthier people who also live in or near suburban and urban areas. Perhaps the most prominent barrier to EV adoption is that EVs are uneconomical. CBO's February baseline set the record straight, telling us that the so-called Inflation Reduction Act's EV handout would increase the deficit by hundreds of billions of dollars. I also couldn't help but notice that the price of EVs rose immediately after the IRA's passage to absorb the bill's $7,500 new EV tax credit. These EV costs were then, of course, passed on to the consumer. Of course, now many had to be discounted because they haven't been able to sell them. And I've yet to hear a comprehensive plan to make EV owners pay into Federal Highway Trust Fund. EV drivers are currently free riding on the backs of the middle class. And although some states have instituted an extra fee for so-called fuel-efficient vehicles, making them even more expensive. There are many holes in the rapid EV transition fantasy. They include a lack of critical minerals needed to produce EVs, lack of transmission infrastructure needed to support their increased electricity demands, and our current reliance upon nefarious countries in the EV supply chain. According to the University of Michigan, the world would need to mine 115% more copper from 2018 to 2050 than has been mined in all of human history up until 2018, just to do business as usual. This copper mining doesn't even include the green transition. And the EV, they take 3 to 5 times as much copper as a standard vehicle. I hope we discuss where these critical minerals from the so-called EV transition will come from. China dominates the global critical mineral supply chain, accounting for approximately 60% of the worldwide production and 85% of processing capacity, and we struggle to permit federal projects here in America. From wind turbines to transmission lines to pipelines to hard rock mines. Left-wing environmentalists are holding up the permitting reform needed for the very EV expansion that they claim. The left claims climate crisis, but backs away from comprehensive reform when the environmental lobby comes calling. They also claim to care about air quality and environmental justice, but ignore the unreported and underreported particulate emissions from tires under the heavy weight of EVs. Legislators must do better, and I hope this hearing serves as a stepping stone for honest permitting of dialogue moving forward. As we grapple with environmental red tape, the Chinese are rapidly expanding coal power plants to fuel EV manufacturing boom. I'd like to welcome all today's witnesses invited here by Senator Whitehouse and Graham. And finally, Mr. Chairman, I request unanimous consent to put this article called "Copper Can't Be Mined Fast Enough to Electrify Vehicles." I thank you. Before you go on, I was thinking I mentioned a few inconsistencies in my opening remarks, but I think of others, and maybe it's being the adjective unrealistic or inconsistency may fit a couple things. But Iowa's the #1 producer of ethanol. We have 43,000 jobs in Iowa, and if we had every vehicle in the United States be EVs. You could see what that could do to the particular job that we created 40 years ago to produce a more environmentally friendly product than petroleum is. We have the inconsistency of the rainforest being hacked away to mine nickel in Indonesia. We have the inconsistency of people in the Congress that talk about we got to stop the use of child labor around the globe, and yet we have children mining cobalt in Congo. I mentioned transmission in my opening comment. The chairman mentioned transmission, but this permitting process is halted by environmentalists not wanting to cut red tape here in Washington, D.C. And then you have the silly posture of the Inflation Reduction Act appropriating billions of dollars for charging stations, and I guess to date we have about 8. So I just think there's a lot about this whole process that hasn't been thought out very well. I'm done now.
Well, I hope that the $125 billion in private capital that has been dedicated to this says otherwise.
That's
Senator Graham.
That's mercantile economic policy of the federal government.
Well, thank you. Good morning.
Good morning.
What have I learned? We have donuts at the Budget Committee, and I'm going to take a wild guess. Senator Grassley did not buy them. But he's welcome to as many of them as he wants. Senator Grassley, you laid out real challenges, and everything you said is real. So what I want to do is thank the chairman for having this committee hearing about electric vehicles, because I'm in a very heavy car manufacturing state. And they're making electric cars and hybrid cars and all kind of cars. And I'm trying to figure out sort of like what should we be doing and when should we do it as a nation. I met with the Chinese ambassador yesterday. I hadn't talked to him in a very long time. I'm going to go to China next year. They decided 15 years ago to get in this business for some reason. It seems to be like they were pretty smart. A lot of people are buying electric cars. President Trump says, let them buy electric cars, do away with the mandate. Yeah, it makes some sense to me. The world seems to be making more electric cars and using electric cars. And what does that mean for us? Well, if you really want to compete in this space, Senator Grassley laid out some real challenges. Power. Let's say half the cars on the road at some point in time become electric. The grid demand will go through the roof. How can you generate enough power to accommodate electric vehicles, and where does it come from? Can you do it with all renewables, and how do you do it without natural gas? You can't. So to my friends in the environmental world, we need to be thinking about increased power production that can actually occur. That means regulatory reform and everything Senator Whitehouse just mentioned, but nuclear power. EVs, as projected, will take up all the power produced by the nuclear industry and certain renewables just by themselves. These data centers, you know, you're blessed to have them, but you're cursed too, because they're just power consumers. So it seems the digital economy and electric vehicles is going to increase demand for power in a way nobody's really thought through. And where does the new power come from? How do you get it online? How do you get it delivered? Is something I think worthy of the Congress's consideration, not just this committee. So, Chairman Whitehouse, thank you very much for having this. The demand seems to be real apart from the mandate. So what happens to the Highway Trust Fund? $5 billion in lost revenue if the numbers projected come true in the United States. So as Senator Grassley indicated, if you're driving an electric vehicle, we got to find some way for you to pay into maintaining the roads. I don't know what the right answer is, but we better come up with it pretty quick. You know, we aim and shoot first and aim later is sort of what we're doing here. We're setting a goal to have 50% of all the cars in America become electric, but we haven't really thought through how you improve the grid to get there. Where does the revenue come from that will be lost? And China, to my colleagues, we're in competition with China in many areas. They dominate this market. Do we really want to replace dependence on Mideast oil and gas with China dominance of the supply chain in electric vehicles? The processing facilities to make a battery really don't exist here. How do you create them? And as Senator Grassley indicated, where do the resources necessary to make a battery come from? If we could make a battery out of corn, that'd be good. I don't think we can, but I'm willing to have an open mind about that. So the bottom line is this is coming whether we like it or not. And I think there's an upside to it, to be honest with you. And there's definitely a downside. So from a national point of view, it seems to me that we've set a goal and we have not put the infrastructure in place to meet that goal. And from a Republican point of view, if you said there is no more mandate, I'd be curious to see what kind of sales would occur without a mandate. It wouldn't go to zero. Over the arc of time, there are going to be more electric vehicles, not less, in the United States. And over the arc of time, there are going to be a lot of Chinese electric cars all over the world. I'd like to compete in this space. Forget about the mandate for a moment. Consumers, particularly younger people, are into this. And the world is into this. America needs to play in this space for a variety of reasons. Whether it's clean air, whether it's just creating jobs for the new economy, whatever reason, we need to think long and hard about how we compete, the challenges we face, and we're behind in a game that's being played by China very aggressively. And when it comes to America's national security interest, I think we need to compete in the transportation space. So thank you for having the hearing. I don't know what the answers are to all these questions, but I do know that the march toward electric vehicles is inevitable.
Thank you, Senator Graham. We have 5 witnesses here today who've been agreed on, each a bipartisan selection. The first is Dr. Jesse Jenkins, assistant professor at Princeton University with a joint appointment in the Department of Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering and the Andlinger Center for Energy and Environment. Dr. Jenkins also leads Princeton's Zero Carbon Energy Systems Research and Optimization Laboratory, which conducts modeling to evaluate low-carbon energy technologies and generate insights to improve energy and climate planning. Our second witness is Britta Gross, Director of Transportation at EPRI, formerly the Electric Power Research Institute. In her role, Ms. Gross is responsible for defining the market strategies needed to accelerate the electrification of the transportation system with a focus on identifying the gaps that need to be addressed to achieve 2030 climate goals. She was formerly the Director of Advanced Vehicle Commercialization at General Motors. So I hope she was smiling when we talked about bolts. Third is Maureen Hinman, the co-founder and executive chair of Silverado Policy Accelerator. Prior to founding Silverado, Ms. Hinman served as Director for Environment and Natural Resources at the Office of the United States Trade Representative. She also served as at the U.S. Department of Commerce as Senior Industry Trade Specialist responsible for international policy development and interagency advocacy for the U.S. environmental technology. Silverado is helping this committee in a number of areas, and I'm grateful to Ms. Hinman for being here. Our next witness is David Schwedert, the Chief Policy Officer at the Alliance for Automotive Innovation. Before joining the Alliance, David Schwedert was the interim president and CEO of the Alliance for Automobile Manufacturers. Prior to joining the Auto Alliance in 2015, Mr. Schwedert worked in the U.S. Senate for over 15 years, holding various positions, including staff director of the Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation. Welcome back, Mr. Schwietert. And last but not least, we have Jeff Davis, a senior fellow with the Inno Center of Transportation. Mr. Davis joined Inno in 2015 from his own transportation and public works research and consulting company. He started his career working in the House of Representatives, so also welcome back to you, Mr. Davis. Thank you all for joining us today. Dr. Jenkins, please proceed. You have 5 minutes for an oral statement, and your testimony, like that of all the others, will be put into the record completely.
Graham for organizing the hearing and the opportunity to testify. Thank you. I thank the chairman, the ranking member, and Senator Graham for the opportunity to testify and for organizing the hearing today. I'm Jesse Jenkins, a professor of energy systems engineering at Princeton University. I also lead the REPEAT project, which assesses the impacts of federal energy and climate policy. But I have to note that all views expressed today are my own. The United States is now in the early stages of a momentous transition in the automotive sector. Over 1.1 million battery electric vehicles were delivered to U.S. consumers in 2023, alongside over 183,000 plug-in hybrid electric vehicles. So by the end of 2023, almost 1 in 10 light-duty vehicles sold in the U.S. had a plug. This transition to electric vehicles is a central pillar in the United States' efforts to both cut greenhouse gas emissions and reduce our vulnerability to shocks in global oil markets. Today, the United States is producing more oil than any country at any point in history. And yet, the U.S. economy remains dangerously exposed to the volatility of global oil prices. The decisions of a dictator to invade a neighbor or a disaster on the other side of the world can send the cost of filling the tank in Denver or Des Moines soaring. And every $10 per barrel increase in the price of oil is a $210 million per day tax on American consumers and businesses. So we simply cannot drill our way to energy security, but we can electrify. By severing our reliance on gasoline and diesel to fuel our cars and trucks, we can finally secure America's independence from global oil shocks. Electrifying transportation is also critical to meet national climate objectives. Switching to EVs and cleaning up our grid is the critical 1-2 punch that will decarbonize transportation. President Biden established a goal to cut U.S. greenhouse gas emissions to half of our peak levels by 2030. To reach this goal, electric vehicle sales should make up about half of all light-duty vehicle sales by that date. That's up about 5-fold from today's share. Yet, over the last 9 months, sales of plug-in vehicles in the United States have plateaued, driving a growing gap between current trends and our U.S. climate targets. Electric vehicle sales growth actually accelerated through the third quarter of 2023, regularly exhibiting explosive year-on-year growth rates of roughly 40 to 60%. But beginning in the fourth quarter of 2023, growth in U.S. EV sales has stalled, a trend that's continued through the first half of this year. At the current pace, sales of plug-in vehicles are up just 9% this year. If we look beyond the top-line numbers, it's clear that the story so far is mostly about Tesla. Over the first half of 2024, Tesla's sales contracted by 13%, while sales of all other plug-in hybrid vehicles and plug-in and electric vehicles are up a healthy 31%. That's right in line with the REPEAT project's expectations for this year for the sector as a whole. Taking a step back, consumer surveys find that about half of U.S. vehicle buyers are considering buying an EV within the next 12 months, indicating substantial consumer interest and potential for large market growth. Cost and charging-related concerns remain the most commonly cited barriers to consumer adoption, but both trends are improving, thanks to both market competition and private investment, as well as supportive public policy. Millions of new EVs do mean much more demand for electricity, raising the question, is the U.S. grid prepared? First, it's important to note that given the dynamics of the fleet turnover, even if 100% of new vehicle sales were electrified tomorrow, it would still take about 15 years before the entire fleet of on-road vehicles were electrified. And it will take considerably longer than that given current trends. So we have some time to prepare America's electricity infrastructure, markets, and regulations for widespread adoption. But we best not waste that time. REPEAT Project's 2024 current policy scenario expects EVs to consume the equivalent of about 8% of current total U.S. electricity use by 2030 and 17% by 2035. To put it another way, by 2035, EVs could consume nearly as much electricity as is produced today by the entire fleet of nuclear power plants or all non-hydro renewables combined. So while a lot of attention has recently been paid to increasing demand from data centers and AI, electric vehicles are actually likely to be a larger driver of electricity demand growth over the next decade than artificial intelligence. EV chargers also represent large new instantaneous power demands that could put stress on grid infrastructure. Coming home and plugging an EV into the level 2 charger is like flipping the switch on about a dozen or more window-mounted air conditioning units. Fortunately, it should be possible to avoid charging EVs during peak periods. Assuming only a modest level of flexible charging, repeat project scenarios expect EVs to contribute less than 4% of peak U.S. electricity demand in 2030 and 7% by 2035. Broader use of managed charging programs could further reduce, if not eliminate, the contribution of electric vehicles to peak grid uses. The technology for that is available today. All that's missing are the appropriate incentives. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ms. Gross, please proceed.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Ranking Member, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. I'm Britta Gross, the Director of Transportation at EPRI. EPRI is an independent, nonprofit energy research and development institute founded in 1972. The electrification of the transportation sector is challenging from a grid perspective, given the size of the load, the shorter lead times, and the fact that cars and trucks are mobile, which means this load can appear just about anywhere on the grid. But a load of this size is not unprecedented. Between 1965 and 2005, the grid adapted to a load twice as large as transportation. Electrifying transportation is also an opportunity to diversify the load that's currently on the grid, which normally shows up as early morning or late afternoon load peaks. Utilities have to design for these peak loads to ensure electricity is reliable. But if utilities can take advantage of this typically flexible transportation resource, for example, to charge most vehicles at night, this can help minimize new grid investments and ensure a more affordable transition. Though the grid impacts of electric transportation will eventually be felt across the generation, transmission, and distribution systems, the near-term impacts are being felt on local distribution systems, those wires that lead to our homes, our offices, fleet depots, and charging sites today. When we look at the overall impact that 279 million vehicles will have on the grid, the light-duty vehicles, the cars most of us drive every day, they will consume the most energy. But that load will be distributed across the entire grid, and its impact on a local distribution circuit is generally minimal. But heavily concentrated fleets such as airport, car rental fleets, and trucking fleets will bring larger loads to these local distribution systems. So in EPRI's work, though we consider all loads from light-duty vehicles to heavy-duty vehicles, we're especially focused on fleets and trucking loads. A challenge that's unique to transportation is the timing mismatch between vehicle procurement and the time it takes to make grid upgrades. A fleet operator can order a dozen heavy-duty electric semis to be delivered in about 4 to 6 months today. Yet the time it takes to bring additional power to that site for charging can take anywhere from 18 months on average to multiple years if more significant grid upgrades are required. A second challenge is the market complexity. There are over 3,000 utilities and tens of thousands of fleet operators who have seldom had to deal with electric utilities. This means a fleet operator or a charging property developer with hundreds of sites nationwide has to be able to identify the right utility to begin planning efforts and then figure out how to apply for service when utilities all use different processes. To address these pain points, these key industries have to work together with utilities in unprecedented ways to share their electrification plans earlier with utilities and with utility regulators so that there's advanced knowledge of where and when loads will show up on the distribution system. Drawing on the expertise of the utility industry, fleet operators, charging providers, and vehicle manufacturers, we launched the EVs to Scale initiative and identified 2 critical tools to address current challenges and enable industry to get to scale. The first is an interactive online map that identifies where and when transportation loads are likely to appear on the grid at a local distribution feeder level. As fleet operators and charging providers share more of their electrification plans with us, confidence grows in where to prioritize these grid investments. And this map also now shows how much power is currently available on a utility's feeders to serve these loads. To our knowledge, this is the first time available hosting capacity maps have been aggregated in a single location and made public. This online mapping tool is available today. The second tool is a standardized service application template for the utility industry that provides fleet operators and charging developers with a common application form to request service for a charging site anywhere in the U.S. This will eliminate much of the time, complexity, and cost involved in reaching out to one utility at a time and providing the same information to different utilities. It is analogous to the College Common App process. This Common App tool is in development and will be available by the end of this year. Leading companies in transportation electrification, including Amazon, Enterprise, Daimler Truck, Volvo Truck, and many others, are working with EPRI and the utility industry leaders to design these tools to ensure they will address the barriers to large-scale electrification of transportation. Thank you again to the committee for the opportunity to share insights on this important topic. I look forward to answering your questions.
Thanks so much, Ms. Gross. Dr. Hinman, sorry.
Chairman Whitehouse, Ranking Member Grassley, Senator Graham, and distinguished members of the committee, it is my sincere pleasure to appear before you today. My name is Maureen Hinman, and I am the chair and co-founder of Silverado Policy Accelerator, a nonprofit, bipartisan think and do tank, focusing on developing novel policy solutions to our most pressing economic, environmental, and national security challenges through a focus on rigorous research, cross-domain policy engagement, and granular policy implementation. Fittingly, the challenges before the global battery and electric vehicle supply chain represent a fulcrum of these risks, challenging our ability to transition American lives and livelihoods to a clean economy, maintain critical manufacturing base, and preserve energy independence. Currently, the EV battery sector is following a well-tread pattern of the United States acting as chief global innovator on critical emerging technologies, but falling short on the downstream industrial development because our market economy, bound by the rule of law, cannot reasonably compete with the openly predatory, non-market industrial policies of the Chinese Communist Party. To change this script, we need to broaden the collective understanding of the impact the CCP's policies have on global competition and American national security. While yielding price distortions that have created low costs for consumers in the short term, the CCP's industrial policies ultimately create an unsustainable risk matrix for the United States. For example, battery cell production costs, which comprise about 30 to 40% of the total vehicle production cost, sit at $114 per kilowatt hour in the United States, compared to just $82 per kilowatt hour in China. This difference is owed to the fact that materials remain about 30% cheaper in China. A cursory look at the EV battery supply chain reveals a troubling state of play. China has captured the balance of global supply chains for refined mineral products, battery components, and final products including battery cells and electric vehicles. For several of the mine products that are unavailable within China itself, Chinese firms own a major stake in mines globally. China controls 28% of lithium mines, 41% of cobalt mines, and nearly 20% of copper mines. The CCP achieves these results through an industrial policy playbook I call the 6 S's. First, China sets specific goals and targets for what it determines to be priority sectors, including through sector-specific 5-year plans. Next, the CCP shelters its infant industries from markets and competition using tools such as tariff and non-tariff barriers and limits on foreign investment. Simultaneously, China subsidizes target industries directly across the value chain and through a variety of payment systems, both formal and informal, including environmental arbitrage, and operating firms in a way that a market economy underpinned by the rule of law could simply not sustain. Concurrently, Chinese firms, and often the government itself, are encouraged to acquire or outright steal foreign technologies and then merge and innovate upon them without the costs associated with legal acquisition of intellectual property. Once Chinese technologies have a toehold in global markets, the CCP subverts competition through a variety of market strategies, including undermining market pricing by building overcapacity in production untethered to real demand, and then exporting the surplus on the global market at below-cost prices, throttling or limiting supply to undermine competitors, making strategic investments in adjacent industries and critical infrastructure in key markets, and engaging in economic coercion and intimidation. Finally, once China has established a near-market monopoly, Chinese firms sell everywhere at a price of their choosing, weaponizing supply chains in their favor. The CCP's approach dwarfs other nations' efforts, not just in strategy, but critically in scope, scale, and consistency across the entirety of the supply chain. Put simply, China unfairly and illegally subsidizes more programs for more critical nodes over a longer period and with more dollars. The CCP's stated goal is to establish a global monopoly power in all critical industries, and they are well on their way to achieving this end in the EV battery market. The International Energy Agency anticipates that China's battery manufacturing capacity will account for 77% of world demand by 2030. These cheap batteries are no deal. Effectively countering these efforts will require that the United States and market economies deploy coordinated, agile policies at a scale sufficient to correct for the market distortions and to protect U.S. public and private investments in industrial and environmental security. Silverado and I remain at your service as you devise policies that can meet this generational challenge. Senators, I thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Ms. Hinman. Next is Mr. Schwedert.
Chairman Whitehouse, Ranking Member Grassley, Senator Graham, and members of the committee. My name is David Schwedert. I'm the Chief Government Affairs and Policy Officer at the Alliance for Automotive Innovation, representing the automakers, battery suppliers, and, producing most of the vehicles sold in the U.S. Thank you for the invitation to testify and to share our perspective this morning on the U.S. electric vehicle market and policies to help accelerate this transition. Today, I want to provide the auto industry perspective on the shift towards electrification and to give the committee a status report about not only what's working, but also where there's work to be done. Let's start with this. Electrification is transforming personal mobility. It's rewriting global supply chains, rebuilding domestic industrial base, and creating jobs. An underpinning of the American economy and, of course, our national security in fundamental ways. Today, 113 electrified products, sedans, pickups, utility vehicles, and van models are available for sale in the U.S. This includes battery electric, plug-in hybrid, and fuel cell vehicles. There's also increasingly efficient internal combustion engine technologies, lots of choices in powertrain and vehicle type, something for sale that meets the needs of every customer. Choice is a priority for automakers. Last year, 9.5% of all U.S. light-duty sales were electric or zero emission, up from 2.4% in just 2020. Even with this major momentum, we're in a challenging period, as Senator Graham noted this morning. Yes, the EV market is still growing, but the growth is slowing. One reason, most EV early adopters have already adopted the technology. Spikes in EV demand or choppy growth are certainly not surprising. In our view, this massive transformation is a marathon, not a sprint. Shifting to electric personal mobility requires nothing short of a complete transformation of the global automotive industrial base. And the companies I represent are self-funding this transition and have committed over $125 billion to EV production and battery manufacturing across the country so far. This is expected to create 100,000 jobs at major facilities in South Carolina, Georgia, Tennessee, Alabama, Michigan, Ohio, Kentucky, Kansas, Indiana, and other states. My written testimony includes a map of these cutting-edge facilities all over the Midwest and Southeast. Senators, we're building these vehicles and localizing these supply chains here at home right now. But the truth is, these massive capital transformations are huge bets, and they're funded using profits generated from gas-powered vehicles. Automakers know that a shift at this scale won't happen overnight. This transition takes time and patience, and it's important to the committee and policymakers to understand these dynamics as well. Collectively, we cannot get ahead of the customer, especially when we are expanding public charging infrastructure or expanding grid capacity. Finding the right balance between markets and regulations and policy is absolutely key to remaining globally competitive. Let me take one observation about supply chains. This is partially a point about geopolitics, namely China, that controls a vast amount of raw materials and processing capacity for EV batteries. By 2035, the U.S. is anticipated to have supply gaps in excess of 50% of the needed cathode and anode materials, nickel, cobalt, manganese, and graphite. At the same time, America's allies and rivals are trying to secure the same mineral supplies to support their own electrification goals. Domestic mining and processing facilities face long lead times for permitting and development, as well as other obstacles. This is an area where I believe congressional attention and action is needed, and I'm actually pleased to know that this morning the Senate Energy Committee is taking up bipartisan permitting reform legislation. One last point on China and U.S. competitiveness. At the turn of this century, China was manufacturing around 2 million vehicles. Today, they manufacture 30 million vehicles and have capacity for nearly 50 million. Nearly 1/3 of that production last year was for EVs alone. In other words, China is manufacturing EVs equivalent to the entire U.S. manufacturing output. Without question, the future often offers consumers more vehicle choices than ever, but we've got some challenges in front of us. The auto industry and policymakers need a shared and a realistic vision of success when it comes to automotive electrification. Regardless of political views or what state you live in, we need an approach in this country that balances emission reductions and consumer choice and expands our industrial base and America's ability to compete around the world. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thanks very much. Before I turn to Mr. Davis, an administrative moment to let everybody know that Senator Graham and I are yielding our positions to first Senator Stabenow and then Ranking Member Grassley. So the order at the conclusion of Mr. Davis's 5 minutes will be Stabenow, Grassley, Whitehouse, Graham, Merkley, Braun, at least for openers. Mr. Davis, please proceed.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Ranking Member, Senators, my name is Jeff Davis. I'm a senior fellow at the ENO Center for Transportation. ENO is a 501c3 nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank founded by traffic pioneer William Phelps Eno in 1921. All federal gasoline and diesel fuel tax receipts, along with trucking industry excises, have been deposited in a highway trust fund since 1956 to make it clear that those levies on highway users can only be spent on specific highway programs. Congress has since opened up the trust fund to highway safety and mass transit spending as well. The Highway Trust Fund has been fundamentally insolvent since 2008. Electrification did not start this problem, but it stands to make the problem much worse in the coming years. The state of insolvency is a result of three trends. First, the rate at which driving on U.S. roads increases every year has leveled off. From the 1950s to the end of the 1970s, total vehicle miles traveled, VMT, on American roads grew at a pace to double every 16 years. It slowed so much now the Federal Highway Administration this month projected a future rate at which it would take VMT 140 years to double. Second, taxing the number of gallons of gasoline and diesel fuel used on roads was originally a proxy for taxing VMT. In 1976, the average passenger car on the road burned 7.2 gallons of gasoline for every 100 miles driven. Today, the average passenger car on the road burns 4 gallons of gas every 100 miles. For SUVs and pickups, fuel efficiencies increased from 9.3 gallons per 100 miles in 1976 to 5.6 gallons per 100 miles today. Third, Congress has been unable to either keep trust fund spending constrained to tax receipt levels or else increase tax receipts. Congress has now enacted 5 consecutive multi-year funding bills in which new funding in the final year of each bill was at least 25% above new trust fund taxes and interest. These trends caused the Highway Trust Fund to run out of money in 2008, before the first plug-in EV, and Congress has since provided $272 billion in ad hoc bailouts from the general fund. Now, electrification is having its effects. According to the Congressional Budget Office's June 24 forecast, the number of gallons of gasoline taxed for the Highway Trust Fund will fall from about 138 billion gallons in 2024 to 89 billion gallons in 2034. Annual gasoline tax receipts are projected to drop more than 5% per year starting in 2030. If we combine this newly projected drop in gas tax revenues with currently projected trust fund spending, annual cash deficits in the $13 billion a year range today will jump to an astounding $51 billion deficit in 2034, a decade from now. Because the trust fund used to be solvent on a user pay basis and for other historical reasons, trust fund spending is exempt from most of the restrictions and controls in federal spending written into the Budget Act and subsequent process statutes in this committee's jurisdiction. If one were to try to fix that projected $51 billion trust fund deficit in 2034 solely by increasing gasoline taxes, and let me emphasize, absolutely no one is advocating this, the current 18.3 cent per gallon gasoline tax to the trust fund would need to be increased by about 58 cents per gallon to a total tax of about 76 cents per gallon of gasoline. There are alternatives to motor fuel taxes that could continue the user pay, user benefit paradigm that underlies federal trust funds, which I address in my written testimony, but none are nearly as easy to administer as the gasoline tax. Going from fuel to vehicle as the subject of taxation means going from about 1,300 points of collection of gasoline taxes and diesel taxes to 279 million points of collection, which is the number of registered private vehicles in the U.S. in 2022. Taxing vehicles will be over 200,000 times as much work for the IRS as taxing motor fuel. In short, if rapid decarbonization of highway transportation is to be a federal policy goal, Congress should carefully consider whether and how to replace the fossil fuel-based highway user taxes that currently support highway and mass transit spending with some other revenue source. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thanks very much. And I will now turn to the distinguished senator from Michigan, who I think knows and cares more about the auto industry than pretty much anybody around here.
Well,
Senator
thank
Stabenow.
you so much, Mr. Chairman, and Senator Graham, who I know cares passionately about manufacturing. We share that in common. And I could talk all day. I won't. I know I don't have all day to talk about this. But let me first start by saying that no one is forcing Americans to buy electric vehicles, but I have one. Nobody forced me to get it. My price didn't go up with the tax credits. Unfortunately, the latest round of tax credits is so complicated and limiting that it's certainly not helping as much as it could help. But I will say the biggest issue is charging stations, and I'm about to test that again. I mentioned to the chairman, I haven't driven my car from here to Michigan in about a year, and I'm going to test it again to see how many more charging stations we have to be able to get me back to Michigan in a couple of days. I do want to emphasize, though, and I've said this before, in 1917, when Congress began heavily subsidizing oil production because of fines down in Texas, we didn't have gas stations on every corner either. And in fact, at the same time, Henry Ford and Thomas Edison were working to develop a battery-operated car, but they had no subsidies. So Congress picked a winner, and they won for over 100 years, and now we're trying to expand this out. And I would say also, Senator Graham, I agree with you. We have a lot of issues. And I guess what I would say is I think we know more of what the answers are. We just need to do it. And then we need to find out where we need to know more about this. But chargers, we know we need more charging stations. Electric grid capacity, absolutely. Both of those things are beginning to happen. We're investing in that through the bipartisan infrastructure bill, more usable consumer credit, more American access to rare earth materials. We actually have new mining capacity, lithium capacity being developed in Nevada, which is very exciting because we're way behind. I would also say that our companies are looking at using different kinds of technology that don't take all those rare earth materials. Also recycling, which is becoming a job creator in Michigan for materials. So there's a lot of things. There have more battery production, which we know that we need in the United States. And of course, we need to change the Highway Trust Fund, absolutely. But I support American innovation. I will tell you in Michigan right now, we have a stretch of road being built that actually has the charging technology in the road, Mr. Chairman, so that when you drive, you will automatically have your car charged. So I support American innovation. Are we there? No, but we are certainly getting there. And I would also say this, our biggest competitor, there's no question about it, is China. But right now, our companies are competing against a country. That's what's happening. There is not a level playing field. Specifically, China is coming for us. They want to corner the EV market, and their government has heavily subsidized this effort. And they've also been willing to steal our patents, I should tell you, coming from Michigan. So what do? I mean, I believe, have the smartest, most talented auto workers and automakers in the world. We need to do our part to help them create a level playing field. And that's why I'm so glad that we are doing this hearing, because we're talking about more than 10 million good-paying jobs right now. So, Mr. Jenkins, in your testimony, you mentioned the most important thing Congress can do now for the EV sector is to provide policy certainty and continuity. Could you talk a little bit more about that? I know that our private sector, our automakers say, just give me certainty about what's going on.
Thank you, Senator. By that, I mean that the tax credits that were implemented in the IRA have just been finalized in terms of their guidance, and many of the programs authorized and funded by the infrastructure law are authorized to spend down through 2026. So these programs are just getting underway, and industry needs to know that they can count on a stable policy environment to make the hundreds of billions of dollars of investments that they've announced across the United States, and to do that with confidence to drive innovation and to expand our supply chains. And so I think the most important thing that can be done now is to provide that confidence for the industry with bipartisan support for the maintenance of existing policies. Also note that on the consumer side, consumers are just getting familiar with how these tax credits work. January this year, we started to offer at point of sale rebates. That's a new thing for people. So there's a lot for people to get familiar with. We just set the stage. Let's let our American companies and innovators play on that stage and do what they do best.
Great, thank you. And Mr. Swetcher, would you just briefly comment on the same issue?
Sure, Senator. Obviously, policy certainty is absolutely essential. I mean, you talked about not just the certainty as it relates to potential tax incentives, but in a competitive environment, we need to look beyond just 5 or 10 years. We need to ensure that policies are in place to ensure that the U.S. is competitive, not just tomorrow, but well beyond that. So that certainty is important. And Senator, as you know, oftentimes, the general public forgets about the long lead times in automobile manufacturing and production. Right. The decisions made today in calendar year 24, model year 25, are effectively locked. Manufacturers are already looking out to model years 28. So policies that change today have a material impact, but they don't fully get realized for years to come. So that's why that policy certainty is so important. We need to ensure incentives are here to build resilient supply chains, to support consumers, as well as to attract the investment and the jobs that we're witnessing.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks very much, Chairman Stabenow. Ranking Member Grassley.
I'm going to start with Dr. Jenkins. Your written testimony notes, quote, President Biden established a target to cut U.S. greenhouse gas emissions to half of peak levels by 2030. To reach this goal, electric vehicle sales should be making up about 50% of the light-duty vehicle market by that date, up about 5-fold from today. Your testimony also recognized, quote-unquote, a remarkable collapse in EV sales this year. Given the evident lack of demand for EVs, is this Biden-Harris administration goal of 5 times today's EV sales attainable by 2030?
Great questions, Senator Grassley. At this stage, I should note that's a goal. It's non-binding, and we'll see where consumers go with the products that are being offered on the market. I'll note, as I did in my oral testimony, that most of the collapse in sales, all of it really is Tesla, who is the market leader, responsible for about 45% of all plug-in vehicle sales. So if they're stumbling to sell their vehicles, it's very difficult to see the overall market expand at a pace that's consistent with that goal. But the rest of the market is becoming increasingly diversified. We're seeing strong growth in a variety of companies offering more and more products that consumers want at price points that they can afford. And we're seeing increased interest from consumers. As I mentioned, over half of consumers surveyed are interested in buying an EV within the next year. Not all of them will do so, but that indicates substantial opportunity to grow. And we're in the early stages of this transition.
Dr. Sweetheart, your written testimony states in bold, quote, if U.S. policymakers do not support the development, commercialization, and acceptance of electrified vehicles, our nation risks becoming more dependent on foreign sources for raw materials and critical minerals in the future defined by our competitors. You also note that, quote, China is manufacturing EVs on a scale equivalent to the entire manufacturing output of the auto industry in the United States. The left is holding up the environmental permitting reform necessary to mine for the domestic critical minerals, which we need to compete with China, while urging a massive EV market share expansion. It just doesn't add up. So my question, should we do more to mine for critical minerals domestically? And what specific pieces of environmental legislation should we amend to improve our mining capacity? And let me suggest before you answer that maybe a couple months ago I read about the nickel mining in Indonesia at the same time that our own government was not allowing such mining in Minnesota.
Well, Senator, thank you for those questions. I would like to underscore that, again, there's a record number of options and choices available to consumers today. As it relates to the supply chains, the best time to start was yesterday. The next best time on permitting was to start today. So we can't have permitting reform fast enough as it relates to addressing not only what the U.S. may need for future supply chain resilience, but also working with our allies and partners, knowing that obviously auto standards are set well into the future. And even if we started today with mining and extracting in the U.S., it might be 15 or more years before we may see the benefits of that extraction processing. So again, I think that underscores the critical importance. If the U.S. is to remain competitive across all vehicle platforms, that the supply chain piece is fundamental.
I think you expressed the inconsistency between environmental policies and what the same environmentalists think we ought to do for EV vehicles. Mr. Davis, as you know, the federal government highway trust fund has operated at a deficit, is currently projected by the Congressional Budget Office to become insolvent in 2028. Even though the existing taxes that fund the trust fund generally adhere to user pays principle for surface transportation, the federal government has not followed the lead of at least 24 states that impose higher registration fees on EVs to compensate for lost gas revenue. Do you agree that if we want to maintain the user fee pays principle that has traditionally guided these trust fund taxes, we should ensure EVs are also paying their fair share?
Thank you, Senator. If you want to maintain the user pay, user benefit principle, then all vehicles that use the road should pay something. The question of what would the proper way be to tax EVs it depends on, first of all, if the government is going to shift away from gasoline tax to another method in general. If so, you tax EVs like you tax the rest of them on mileage or whatever. If not, the states that are doing EV registration fees, as long as they are around the ballpark average of what an internal combustion vehicle of the same size and axle weight would do on average mileage, is a sort of proxy. It's not a great proxy because it doesn't differentiate between the car that drives 3,000 a year and the car that drives 30,000 miles a year. But right now, it's about $89 a year is the average in gasoline taxes paid for a passenger car, and it's about $110 in federal fuel taxes paid for a larger SUV or pickup truck. If an annual registration fee for EVs were in that ballpark, you could honestly say that it was as close an approximation of a true user fee as it would be easy for the IRS to administer and would be consistent with the user pay, user benefit principle.
Thank you very much, Senator Grassley. Ms. Gross, you and Dr. Jenkins both talked about how EVs can contribute to our electric grid security through peak shaving or even putting power back into the grid when it's needed. In terms of peak shaving, you'd need the capacity to tell charging EVs to stop charging through the peak period and then automatically resume charging. So you'd need a signal to the automobile from the utility and willingness of the consumer to accept that. To do that peak shaving function, what does Congress need to do to help? Are there standards that need to be built in? Is the industry doing it on its own? And let me ask you to go first, and Dr. Jenkins, if you had added thoughts, you can follow up. But Ms. Gross, you first, please.
Sure, happy, thank you, Senator, for the question. Happy to talk through this one. Yeah, the electric vehicles it's unlike a load we've ever seen before on the grid. It's the smartest, biggest, and most flexible load. So there's this huge opportunity to charge the vehicles at night. Many, not all, not if you're taking a long distance trip or you're trucking and you have to travel during the day. But that opportunity to charge when the grid has spare capacity is a huge opportunity. It's going to keep our costs low on the grid too. That capital investment in ever increasing the peak that has to be served on the grid. So this idea that V to G and V1G, either single direction, which is basically smart charging, charge
V to
when I
G
want you
meaning vehicle
to.
to grid.
Beg your pardon?
V to G meaning vehicle to grid.
Vehicle to grid,
Yeah.
perfect. Vehicle to grid is, and also vehicle to grid meaning and also bidirectional. So that not only can I take power from the grid when there's plenty of surplus capacity at night, or maybe when a lot of sun is shining in some of the states, but I can also give back to the grid when there are times when the grid is struggling to keep up with maybe load on the grid. And so V to G is certainly a promise that's out there. There's a lot of work getting done in that area, but smart charging is here today.
You and Dr. Jenkins both to provide a written recommendation to Senator Graham and to myself about what we might do working together to make sure that as EVs come online, they have the necessary capability so that the consumer can take advantage of that capability. And also, if you're going to offer a utility that capability, that adds value to the utility. What benefit should the consumer get from the utility for offering up their vehicle as a resource, either by taking it willingly offline during peak periods or by limiting charging to the night, or however that works? It's a bit of a complicated question, but I think there's room for real bipartisan activity here, and I'd love to have a recommendation from both of you. In my remaining 2 minutes, Ms. Hinman, first of all, thank you for all your terrific work. You've described the economic and national security risks of Chinese, what you called weaponized supply chains. Is there also a climate risk associated with China's supply chains?
Yes, thank you so much, Senator. Absolutely. So China's.
And is there a policy that would help fix that?
I think I know of at least one. China's rent-seeking also arrives in this form of sort of what we call environmental arbitrage, or creating a pollution subsidy. So essentially how it works, even though China has the technical capacity to enforce its own environmental rules, because it produces many of those in technologies, and in fact, in air pollution control in particular, is the world's leading exporter of air pollution control technology. There's widespread evidence that China, particularly among their state-owned enterprises, intentionally reduces its inspection rates and then refuses to operate its air pollution control machinery. Now, if you look at like a coal-fired power plant scrubber, if you leave that scrubber off, that reduces your energy costs of operation of air pollution control materials by about 15 to 20% total. So you're getting a 15 to 20% pollution subsidy on your total energy production for everything that you produce that comes off that coal-fired power plant. I don't know a single manufacturing firm in the United States that wouldn't love a 20% subsidy on their energy costs. This is deeply unfair. It's unfair in terms of competitive sense, but also in a climate and environmental sense, because that is SOx, NOx, and of course carbon and other climate pollutants being pumped up into the air at a deeply unfair rate that advances our decline in terms of climate stability. One important way that we could counter this is that both the United States and friends could actually levy a border fee that corrects for this market imbalance and levels the playing field in terms of both climate and other pollution values. The figures behind this are known, and I know there's several very good bills floating around the Hill right now, both on the quantification side, but also on the particulars on those measures and how we might work with partners.
And that makes a perfect segue to Senator Graham, who, along with Senator Cassidy, has a bill to that effect. And I would note that Ambassador Lighthizer, who is President Trump's trade representative, is also a fan of that policy. So with that, let me turn it over to Senator Graham and thank him again for helping put this hearing together.
Well, and I'll thank you and Senator Grassley for having, because this is the first of many conversations I think we're going to have. Mr. Schweikert, did I say your name right?
Schwietert.
Schwietert, I'm sorry.
It's a mouthful.
How about David? Okay, David. Are car companies making electric vehicles because they have to or they want to?
Senator, I think there's no question, as you noted earlier, that electrification is the future. So for purposes.
Well, I mean, is it the future based on consumer demand or government policy?
I would say it's a mix. Obviously, I think regulations or policy. Yep.
I agree. Mr. Jenkins, why does China make electric vehicles because of climate policy?
No, it's primarily a response to strategic manufacturing policy and air pollution reduction goals. They basically strategically selected electric vehicles as an opportunity to leapfrog internal combustion engine manufacturing, which is an area that the West, the United States,
But
and
it's
others
not driven
dominate.
by climate. I mean,
It's
if you're
not
really
primarily
worried
driven by
about the
climate.
climate, you wouldn't use a coal-fired plant to power an electric vehicle plant, right?
Well, with China's average grid mix, it actually does reduce greenhouse gas emissions relative to an internal
So
combustion
are they
engine.
making all these cars because they're worried about the environment?
They're worried primarily about air pollution and their strategic role in manufacturing in the global market.
Ms. Heineman, why do we make electric cars? Is it because of consumer demand or government policy?
My sense is it's per my colleague to my left is because it's a combination of the two. But
Okay,
you know,
so-
we're a market economy, so
Right.
the government does work.
So
to help
some
the market
people want
signals.
them, right? So, David, if we did away with the mandate or the goal of having half the vehicle fleet electrified, a government policy, by 2035, what percentage of the cars on the road do you think would be electric without a mandate?
Senator, that's a very good question. Last year was 9.5%. So if we fast forward, it's hard to say. A lot of it depends on how reliant
Well,
we are.
let's just say we did away with the mandate. Trump says he wants to do away. Will that end electric car manufacturing in America?
No. However, we might have unbalanced things as it relates to whether or not the U.S. is competitive as it relates to some of those supportive policies, whether it's
Okay.
tax incentives or,
Right.
yes.
So, Ms. Heineman, is that right, Hinman?
It's Hinman.
Okay, all right. Is the dominance of China irreversible in this supply chain?
I believe not. Absolutely not. I think the U.S. and its allies and friends, if we move quickly to create agile, responsive, and coordinated policies, could flip the script and reestablish market dynamics in the
Okay,
global economy.
I want to talk to you about that in more detail. So forget about what we do here, Mr. Jenkins. Does everybody agree China's going to continue to make a bunch of electric vehicles no matter what we do?
Correct?
Everybody agree with that?
Yes, sir.
For whatever reason, they're going to make a bunch of them. And it seems to me that the supply chain to make a battery, if we don't change our policy, is going to be so dominated by China, we may just have lost this entire area of our economy. Is that fair to say, Mr. David?
Yes, Senator, I would note, and this is something that hopefully resonates with this committee, if we didn't have the regulations, obviously electrification is the future. If the U.S. is taking itself off the global stage for competition, for instance, on average, we're exporting 2 million vehicles a year. So if the U.S. isn't competing on electrification and the rest of the world is, we've got a real risk.
Well,
that we're-
that's what BMW is trying to do in Volvo in South Carolina. Can you be for EVs and against mining, Mr. Jenkins?
Well, I think we need to source the requisite materials for the entire supply chain, and note the environmental impact of that is substantially lower than mining billions of tons of coal or billions of tons equivalent of oil
if
each
you-
year that we light on fire.
Okay, that's good. So if you're for EVs, you need to be for mining here at home. Does that make, everybody agree with that? If you're for EVs, you need to have a robust grid. Do you agree with that, Ms. Gross?
I agree with that.
Because the demand is real. Mr. Jenkins, are you opposed to natural gas as being part of the future of the grid?
Natural gas generation is going to remain a part of the grid for quite some time, particularly for capacity needs, so to meet peak demands. And
So
so
without natural gas, it'd be pretty unrealistic to meet the demand.
that said, we're going to see a reduction in the amount of natural gas consumed by those power plants as we scale up American renewable energy resources that can displace gas
but,
burnt,
as a
if not the
baseload-
capacity.
Is a baseload fuel or renewables are going to get us to where we need to go without natural gas and nuclear
We
power?
don't, Senator, we don't need a baseload fuel. What we need is a combination of resources that can meet all of our demands throughout the year. Renewables are great at supplying energy, but they're reliably unreliable. We know they're not going to be there all the time.
So natural
And so
gas
gas
is
power
more
plants are dispatchable as well as nuclear power
This
plants,
is a rational
batteries, and other
discussion.
resources.
I know I'm 18 seconds over here. what I want to do is just think it through. I'm at a car-heavy state, and they're making EVs, and I agree with you. I think the mandate is probably pushing us. I don't like it, but I think consumers are going to demand some electric vehicles. China's not going to change their policy. It seems to be a part of the future economically, and if we don't watch it, we're going to be out of the battery business. And I would just like to have a rational approach to what I think is an irreversible trend, that there will be more electric cars over time, not less. And I think it'd be a shame to not play in this space. For whatever reason drives you, no pun intended, I think America's going to make some real hard decisions quickly. And if we do it, we will dominate this market, no matter how big it is or how small it might be. I'd like to dominate this market for a lot of reasons, or at least be competitive. I met with the Chinese ambassador yesterday, and I'll close with this. I said, we're going to have an honest discussion about the way you produce electric cars. Get ready for that discussion.
I think before I turn to Senator Merkley, there is a very significant bipartisan common cause towards cleaner energy, lower emissions, and taking back Chinese dominance in this area that they have achieved, to use Ms. Hinman's words, unfairly through mercantilistic interventions and cheating, essentially, in the marketplace. So we need to have ways to respond to that, to make sure we are not dependent on their supply chains for national security, economic, and climate safety reasons. And I think there's a big bipartisan opportunity, so I'm delighted that we're having this. And Senator Graham, I fully look forward to working with you to flesh out what those strong bipartisan policies look like that support our auto manufacturers and the workers who build these beautiful vehicles. Senator Merkley, and then here's the roster. Senator Merkley, Senator Braun, Senator Kaine, Senator Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And certainly one of the reasons there's so much interest in my home state in electrics is because of what's happening right now. We have 121 fires burning in my state. Over 1 million acres have already burned this year. 2 weeks ago, we had more acreage aflame than all the rest of the United States combined. Massive impact on all parts of our state, both with the fires and the smoke. We simply have to dramatically reduce the amount of methane and carbon dioxide we're putting into the atmosphere. But I'll tell you another reason it's so appealing is because of the cost differential. Now, Mr. Jenkins, or Dr. Jenkins, you were talking about the peak load pricing challenge. My local utility offers a plan where if I'm charging after 9 p.m., it's 7.4 cents per kilowatt hour. If I charge from 5 to 9 p.m., which is peak load in my area, it's 33 cents. So we have a little note on our dryer reminding us to turn it on after 9 p.m., but it really has an impact on simply turning on our charger at 9 p.m. at night, and at 220 volts, our car is completely charged, even if it's depleted by the next morning. Mr. Chairman, you were mentioning the question on whether we need a sophisticated system to tell the cars. This is a system that doesn't require anything sophisticated. It's just a pricing plan where people remember to turn on their electric chargers for their cars at night. And it makes shifts a huge part of our electric consumption in that fashion. Now let's take that cost that we're paying of 7.4 cents. Let's round it off to 8 cents. We get over 4 miles per kilowatt hour. Basic math, it's costing us 2 cents per mile to charge to drive our car. Now we'll take our gas and 40 miles per gallon at $4, that's 10 cents. So it's 5 times more expensive to drive a fuel-powered car. Why do we never hear about this? If it was the reverse, and driving your electric car was 5 times more expensive than driving your fuel combustion car, you can bet every fossil fuel company in America would be publicizing that. Why don't we hear that it's 5 times cheaper to drive an electric car? Dr. Jenkins, you want to comment on that?
Well, I do think you raise a great point, Senator Merkley. We're at the early stages of this transition, and I think we do need a lot more advertising and proactive efforts to educate the public from the industry itself, from automakers and dealerships, and potentially from public sources as well. It's a significant cost differential. The upfront purchase prices are higher, and that's another reason why the tax credits established by the IRA are critical to bring down that upfront purchase price. If you build that into the cost of a lease, which many people are turning to purchase new EVs, that is basically a $7,500 additional down payment on the vehicle. And that covers a large amount of the depreciation that you would normally pay for in your lease payments. And that's why the cheapest vehicles on the market right now to lease in virtually every category are electric vehicles. So it's not just cheaper when you operate it, it could be cheaper on a monthly payment basis as well today.
Well, I've talked to a lot of folks who previously were intimidated by those high upfront prices, and they're buying used electrics. Now that we're this far into it, they're buying a used Tesla or a used whatever. And because even though the amount of range declines modestly over time, you're still starting with enough range. You have a lot of range left. So it's really becoming much more affordable to middle-class families through both points that you're making about leasing and about being able to buy a used vehicle. I want to turn to the issue that Senator Stabenow raised about the charging stations. One of the things that has been interesting is how slow we've developed the national standard for the interface. We now have the North American Charging Standard, the NACS standard. Rivian's adopted it, Ford's adopting it, or has adopted it, Chevy's adopting it next year. So, Mr. Chairman, your next Chevy Bolt will be able to use the NACS standard. And Nissan's adopting it. So that's starting to become a solved problem. But one of the ways we could rapidly expand the ability of folks who have cars currently is to have electric charging chargers at rest stops. However, national law, federal law, prohibits that. Is that something we should change?
Yes.
Ms. Gross, would you like to comment on that?
Well, we don't normally comment on policy at EPRI.
Oh, if you don't want to comment, anybody else want to comment?
However, more charging stations are required. They're going to be necessary and they're going to be required for consumers. Consumers demand it, they're going to need it.
Are all of the charging stations that are going to be deployed under the Inflation Reduction Act going to have a NACS standard? Does anybody know the answer to that?
I don't believe that's required, but it's increasingly the case that all chargers are converging to the next standard going forward, and there are adapters now coming to market that allow interoperability. There's already the reverse. You can plug your Tesla into a CCS charge port with an adapter. I'm still waiting for Ford to ship me my adapter for my Mustang Mach-E, but they're sending them for free to all owners of existing Ford vehicles. So this is going to become an increasingly solved problem, as you noted.
This is the Magic Dock adapter, right?
Or just any others. You can have your own adapter you just carry with you in your frunk.
Okay. Listen, my time's up, but I just want to close with this. Everyone, it's 5 times cheaper per mile to drive an electric. And if you buy a used electric, you don't have to worry about the upfront high costs because the depreciation's been paid by somebody else, and it's a sweet deal.
And Dr. Jenkins had to show off that he has a Mustang Mach-E after I said I only had Chevy Bolts. Senator Braun.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The average cost of an electric vehicle is over $17,000 more than the average price of a gas-powered vehicle. So we're doing a lot that is force-feeding something in that's very expensive. We got other issues with it. It's in the context of here we're borrowing now a couple $1 trillion a year, where it was just $1 trillion 6 months ago. And everything we do new, it's 100% borrowed. I think what I'm wondering, and I'd like to ask Dr. Jenkins, Ms. Gross, and Ms. Hinman, given this context, do the three of you believe that consumers should have the right to choose the type of vehicle that best fits their own needs, economic circumstances? Or do you think we ought to be orchestrating this from here when we've never even figured out how to spend less than we take in, and we're currently borrowing from these very same consumers and others around the world to the tune of $2 trillion a year currently.
Senator, I would say that consumers do have the option to choose the vehicles that best suit them. We have a wide variety of offerings on the market today and no requirement that anyone anywhere purchases an electric vehicle. The prices are increasingly affordable as well, so this is a moving target. Costs of batteries, which are the largest component of an electric vehicle, have fallen by about 50% over the last 3 years and are expected to continue to decline going forward. And so that cost premium, you cited $17,000. I looked right now in the compact SUVs category, like a Mustang Mach-E or Tesla Model Y, the gap's about $10,000 up front. And again, the cost of ownership is quite low. So the total cost of ownership is already about at parity.
Do you know the current federal subsidy that goes into electric vehicles, what the amount is per vehicle?
It's up to $7,500 for the consumer
Do you know
purchases.
what that is in total that we're currently doing?
I believe I just read it was about $125 billion, or I can get back to you on that.
Would you agree that all of that's being borrowed to push that onto consumers?
Well, CBO's estimate was that the Inflation Reduction Act was more than paid for, so I'm not sure I agree with that.
I'd say that's a fake pay for, but thank you for your opinion. Okay, we'll go to Ms. Gross and Ms. Hinman.
Senator, thank you for that question. I'll just add, without commenting too much on the policy, I'll just add that consumers are choosing these vehicles. Senator Merkley talked about the energy wallet, the fact that you can feel it in your pocketbook when you don't have to go to the gas station, and the cost of electricity is so much less when you're charging an electric vehicle. I'll also say that truck drivers, data out there shows that truck drivers actually like driving electric vehicles because you don't experience that fatigue that you have with the rumble and the roar of a combustion engine vehicle. So this issue of fatigue is also a safety issue. So we're starting to see, there are reasons to want to drive an electric vehicle based on data that's out there that are really extremely compelling for automakers and truck drivers out there, manufacturers.
Ms. Hinman.
Yeah, thank you so much, Senator. I think it's a little bit of an uncomfortable conversation to have about the fact that we've got a very large predatory market who is influencing prices up and down the value chain in ways that Americans just can't simply compete with. And to me, this sense of sort of how much we're spending is really hard to sort of square against the massive amount of spend and predatory nature that occurs from the Chinese Communist Party. In a perfect world, this would be a pure a global market, right? And we wouldn't feel the need to have to subsidize in the way that we do. I do think there's scope for new tools, particularly trade policy tools and environmental policy tools at the border. But certainly, I think some of these distortions, we have to kind of appreciate its source, which is not coming from Americans, but it's coming from an adversary overseas.
Thank you. And I've got one more question, but I'd like to also tell you that it was about 9 months ago, and I was holding up a letter from 4,000 dealers that said, please don't send us any more EVs. And I'm for the cleanest, least expensive, and like the idea that it's out there as a choice. But 4,000 dealers said they are choking on them. It's even hurt their own enterprises to have to tie it up because they're not moving at the speed at which the government would like to see it, even when they're offering $7,500 a pop. Got one more question, and I'd like a yes or no answer on the part of all of you. I'm for whatever's going to be the cleanest, least expensive fuel in the long run, and even how that impacts electric generation, transportation, the whole gamut. There's been a very robust discussion in the Senate Climate Caucus on that, which I was part of that. We still have great conversations, but a lot of it says that so much of this is going to be due to technological breakthroughs in the future. And as much as we'd like to see those results in the present, we either can't afford it, just doesn't make sense to do it. Now, as it relates to electric vehicles, to all witnesses, does the U.S. currently have the grid capacity to sustain a growing domestic vehicle fleet that is being mandated on consumers by policies from the Biden administration? In respecting time, just give me a yes or no. Dr. Jenkins.
We can expand the grid at a pace that's sufficient to accommodate all of those EVs as we have in the past. This is not an unprecedented challenge. It's one that American utilities can easily meet.
With planning and investment, the pace can be met and grid can be ready.
Yes.
We can meet the demands today, and we need to plan for the future, absolutely.
Yes, if you start today and anticipate where the EV demand will be 10 years from now, you can get there.
Thank you so much.
Mr. Chairman, can I correct the record on one of the statements I just made? The total tax outlays this year, according to Treasury, are $1 billion for the EV subsidies to date. That's through the first half of this year. I think I misspoke by several orders of magnitude, so I apologize about that.
Thank you, Dr. Jenkins. Senator Kane.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I love walking in and seeing the title of the hearing, Bipartisan Senate Budget Committee Hearing. And I appreciate that this has been a hearing and a discussion with witnesses who are really trying to explore an opportunity that has a real upside that is going to need some planning and investment. In Virginia, there's 100,000 electric vehicles on the road in my Commonwealth of 8+ million people. And those who charge at their home pay about $1 a gallon. That's what folks in Virginia are paying if they charge at their home. We need to have some advances in charging in Richmond, where I live. A lot of people don't have driveways, apartments, or multifamily communities, so more curbside, rest area. We need to make sure in the deployment of charging technologies, we're not just looking at passenger vehicles, but we're also looking at trucks. Every Volvo Mack truck that you see on the road in North America is made in Dublin, Virginia, which is in Appalachia, about 3,000 workers there. In the last 10 days, the DOE announced a $208 million investment through the Inflation Reduction Act to match an equivalent investment by the company to expand electric vehicle production. I would encourage, if anybody ever wants to do something fun, come with me to Dublin and drive an over-the-road Volvo Mack truck on their test track. It's about a 3-mile test track. You'll get in that vehicle, and it's so smooth, you think you're going 35, and I looked down at the speedometer, I was going 65. The point about fatigue was remarkable. A diesel truck just has this kind of low-grade rattle that really takes a toll on over-the-road drivers if they're in that truck for multiple hours a day, whereas the electric vehicle is as smooth as can be. And so it is going to be a kind of a fatigue health improvement for those who are doing this job. It's hard to recruit enough over-the-road drivers now. I think this is a technology that might make it a little bit easier. But in addition to the $208 million investment into the Volvo plant through the IRA, there's also been the announcement in the last year of a $100 million investment through DOE to a company called Microporous, a company that will manufacture separators for lithium-ion batteries that are necessary for the EV supply chain, and that is likely to land in rural Southside Virginia near Danville. Both Dublin, Virginia and Danville, Virginia are in economically hard-hit parts of the state. They're both in rural Virginia. Talk a little bit about how the growth of an EV supply chain could be a powerful economic development tool for rural America.
And thanks, Senator. I mean, look, my father's from Youngstown, Ohio. I grew up in Oregon in the shadow of the timber industry and forest products industry that had decayed, during my childhood. I've been hearing, politicians talking about bringing manufacturing jobs back to America literally my entire life, right? And we're finally doing it, right? We're seeing those investments now across, EVs, clean energy, batteries, semiconductors, et cetera. So we're already seeing over $140 billion of announced investment in battery manufacturing and supply chain capacity across the country, and $57 billion in EV manufacturing. That's since the infrastructure law passed. That could support over 240,000 jobs. And we all know these are more than just the direct employment, right? These are anchor employers in these industries or in these communities. And over the vast majority of those are located in rural and exurban communities or communities that are designated as energy communities by the Inflation Reduction Act. So these are exactly the communities that are seeing a renewed economic future.
Say that last piece again.
Yeah, so
the vast
majority are in rural and exurban areas, and the energy communities that have traditionally relied on fossil fuel extraction, processing, or transportation that were designated by the IRA.
This is a hearing about electric vehicles, but the same week that the announcement was made about DOE supporting the manufacture of electric over-the-road vehicles in Dublin, there was also an IRA-driven announcement of $100 million to a facility that is opening up in Chesapeake, Virginia, which is in the Hampton Roads area, metropolitan area, but it's going to manufacture in the United States for the first time the cables that connect to offshore wind and put the power into the grid. all of this has been manufactured overseas because we didn't have an offshore wind industry. Now, because of the IRA, we will be manufacturing those cables, and not just for use in U.S. offshore wind. Those cables, and the company is a Korean company that's investing in Virginia, will be manufactured in the United States and then sold to offshore wind development all over the United States. Just another example of an IRA success story. Okay, now here's a personal story that's embarrassing. I got stuck in my car for 27 hours in January of 22, driving from Richmond to D.C. And it was 18 degrees when the sun was up. It was colder overnight. And it was a freak snowstorm, and the signs on the highway said proceed with caution. They didn't say turn around, go home. They said proceed with caution. I proceeded with caution, and I was stuck for 27 hours. My senior senator, Mark Warner, said I would have gotten SEAL Team 6 to come out and get me. You sat there with a Dr. Pepper and an orange for 27 hours. There was a lot of concern about what would happen to electric vehicles. I had, in a gas vehicle, I had to, run the engine for 10 minutes with the heat at full blast, turn it off until the car got too cold an hour later, and do it again to try to take my half tank of gas and make it work. And there was a lot of questions about what would happen to electric vehicles that night. And I've never introduced into the Senate record an article from Kelley Blue Book, but I just thought there's the first time for everything. Kelley Blue Book did a study. They reached out to people who had been stuck in that snowstorm, who were driving Teslas or other electric vehicles. And they found out that they actually performed better than gas vehicles, and that the way electric vehicle engines work, you can operate just a small portion of the engine that runs the heater. You don't have to have the engine running for the whole car. It does drain the reserve, but very slowly. When finally the traffic started to move, it was blocked by the fact that so many vehicles had run out of gas that even trying to move on the ice-driven roads, you were kind of like a Jenga game. You were kind of moving here, there, and everywhere to kind of get around them. But it turned out that the electric vehicles performed quite well in those adverse conditions. And so, Mr. Chair, if I could, let me introduce this article from Kelley Blue Book, I-95 Traffic Nightmare, What If You Were Stuck in an Electric Car for 24 Hours, into the record.
Without objection, it shall be entered into the record.
I yield back.
And we turn now to Senator Johnson, who will be followed by Senator Van Hollen.
So to prove my environmental bona fides here, my wife has a hybrid SUV, pretty good sized one. And we've actually had it up over 30 miles per gallon. That's when she plugs it in. Every now and again she doesn't, so I think we're down to about 28 right now. So we watch that, okay? Now, I've always wondered, and it's interesting, Senator Kaine, you mentioned $1 a gallon. Is that I don't know, I've never heard really what does it cost. Is that about right, that it's equivalent of about $1 a gallon per gas to charge a EV versus what it costs for gallon gas, whoever's got the information?
Yeah, Senator, I think that's fair. Obviously, it's going to base largely on the utility rates, but I think the working numbers anywhere from 2/3 less costly compared to a gallon equivalent. So whether it's $1 or $1.50.
Well, I'd say it's about 1/3 of the cost. Again, that's pretty attractive, okay? You've got the smooth ride. You got fast acceleration. There's a lot of benefits, okay, as well as in the fact if you're just using a hybrid like my wife does, driving around town, never even has to use gas. So I'm not opposed. But my question is, if they've got so many market appeals, why do we need government subsidies? Take it up. I would say you don't. We should end them. Mr. Schwietert.
Sure, Senator. Obviously, you're talking about affordability generally. Excuse me. Obviously, when it comes to the record number of products, it's both the industrial policy as well as, the marketplace dynamics.
We mess up when government doesn't do very well. For example, we spent $7.5 billion to do charging stations. After more than 2 years, we've got 7 of them. Testimony was talking about we've basically run the Highway Trust Fund into insolvency, and we haven't really fixed that. Why is China producing all these electric vehicles? For its own home market? It's for central planning,
sure,
industrial engineering in other countries, correct? Is there any major Western country that doesn't subsidize EVs because of climate alarmism? How many U.S. automakers are making money producing EVs?
Senator, as I said in my remarks, we're in the early innings. This is a marathon, not a sprint. So yes, costs are going to have to come
Yeah,
down.
well, how much are they losing on average?
Depends on the manufacturer and their product cycle.
So why are they doing it?
It ultimately,
Because they're getting government subsidies, right? The consumers are being subsidized, and the automakers are also being subsidized, correct? And the mandate we're talking about are the things like CAFE standards that coerce them to offer EVs so they can produce vehicles that American consumers do want. I mean, I'd never go to 100% EV. Happy to do the hybrid, happy to be environmental. I want the comfort of having an internal combustion engine.
yeah, Senator, as it relates to the recent auto standards, we've been pretty clear with the Biden administration. Obviously, we need to ensure that there's alignment as it relates to where the market is, as well as encouraging.
No, there won't be alignment where the market is. Government's not that smart. I mean, honestly, $7.5 billion, we have 7 charging stations. We've run the Highway Trust Fund back 2008 insolvent. We haven't fixed that problem. And we're going to have this command economy, and we're going to plan for a growth in the electrical grid. By the way, we don't have the mining capacity. I would argue we really don't have the electrical capacity. Those climate alarmists are generally opposed to nuclear, which certainly would be part of the problem. China dominates the battery industry, and our subsidies are providing a market for China's command economy. How does any of this make sense?
Senator, just with respect, our subsidies are targeted to U.S. manufacturing of batteries through 45X, and the consumer EV tax credits are specifically designed to excise China from the supply chain.
How many consumers have experienced the cost of replacing a battery in an EV?
It's an extremely rare occurrence.
What percent? What
It's an
percent?
extremely rare occurrence.
They don't last forever, do they? How long do they last?
Neither does an internal combustion engine car or transmission.
There are cars on the road from the 30s and 40s and 50s. How long is an EV battery going to last? And what is the cost to replace it?
EV batteries account for anywhere from 30 to 40% of upfront costs. Obviously, there's warranty and durability built into those batteries, but yes.
How long do they last?
The battery itself can last quite some time, and then, of course, it can be
How long?
repurposed and reused.
A couple 100,000 miles at least.
Yeah.
We've had Teslas on the road with that many miles already.
And it's going to cost $10,000, $20,000 to replace?
Well, that's the cost today.
What about recycling of them? What about recycling of wind turbines? I mean, I'm seeing these pictures of these massive dumps of these wind turbines just collapsing. And again, it doesn't make economic sense because government is trying to essentially plan, and government's awful at it.
I just wanted to pipe in if I could,
Sure.
sir, on battery recycling. Batteries are eminently recyclable and are near
Not
closed
these,
loop.
not the lithium batteries. We don't have capacity for doing it right now.
Well,
We
actually-
haven't
We're
developed
building that
a way of
capacity.
doing it.
We are building that capacity, and certainly the U.S. is a leader in the standards.
Kind of like Senator Brown was talking about, yeah, we have to rely on all these technological innovations we don't have yet. And let's face it, they've been trying to innovate batteries for decades and really haven't been able to do it, have they?
I'm not sure I would agree with that. The costs have fallen dramatically. The density has doubled in the last 9 years or 7 years. So battery innovation is dramatic, and with
That's
support.
good. So let the marketplace dictate the speed of this innovation. Stop subsidizing this. That's my only point. I'm not opposed to it, but I'm opposed to government intervention in the marketplace. We just screw things up, and as Senator Brown said, we can't afford it. $35 trillion in debt. We just can't afford all this stuff. Thank you, Mr.
Senator
Chairman.
Van Hollen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank all of you for your testimony. I just make a couple points at the outset. When you have a huge, what economists call externality, which is climate change, I know some of my colleagues don't really believe in that as a threat, but that is exactly where you want government action. And I also heard Senator Graham at the outset talk about how China will potentially, and is right now, on a road, if we don't do something about it, to eat our lunch. I mean, the reality is countries around the world, consumers around the world are going to be purchasing electric vehicles, and either we're at the top of our game or we're going to be left dramatically behind. So that's why I'm pleased that Maryland is one of the states that has set very ambitious goals in terms of EVs, target for 300,000 by 2025. And we're one of 15 states that have committed to ramp up the electrification of medium and heavy-duty trucks so that all sales of those vehicles are zero emission by 2050. There's been lots of evidence of the health benefits of this. The Rocky Mountain Institute estimates that among the 15 states that, along with Maryland, are participating in this effort, they will see fewer premature deaths, 477 fewer premature deaths, and over 6,000 fewer asthma incidents per year. And that's 3.5 billion a year. And that's on top of the climate benefits. I think it's important to point out to my colleagues that while heavy-duty trucks, medium trucks account for only 10% of vehicles on the road, they produce about a quarter of the overall greenhouse gas emissions. So one of the challenges that Volvo, which is a company in Hagerstown, Maryland, is facing, and they developed the powertrain manufacturing, the powertrains. They have a facility there. One of the issues they have there is the issue of charging infrastructure for medium and heavy-duty trucks. So, Ms. Gross, could you briefly describe some of the challenges we're facing in this particular sector and what we should be doing about it?
Thank you, Senator, for that question. Let me focus on the solutions first, and then I'll go to maybe recap on some of the challenges. The most important thing that we can do in this sector for heavy-duty, medium-duty sector is to get pilot programs out there. It is amazing what fleet operators learn by just purchasing and putting into their fleet the first 1-2 trucks, understanding what the relationship has to be with the utility, understanding what charging is, how it works, what it means to discuss rates and off-peak times and on-peak times, and what the economic opportunities are to actually work with the utility on those rates. So the fleet, this idea that we need to continue pilot programs is really alive. It's not the ones that have already started it, but every fleet in the country should start to understand what it would mean to actually have that experience behind you. Once you have that experience, you make better decisions about right-sizing charging and right-sizing the grid requirements for it. We need to prioritize feeders. Where are these truckloads likely to show up? So we've got the E-Road map out there that describes and shows you visually where the loads are expected to come from. We've got Volvo data, Daimler truck data. We know we have the telemetry. We know where the diesel vehicles travel throughout the country. So being able to prioritize where they are today and where they're likely to be when they're electric is super important for prioritizing these investments on the grid. And then finally, one interesting thing is we are kind of going about this piecemeal today. This holds true for light-duty vehicles as well, but on the medium and heavy-duty trucking sector, where these loads can be very concentrated on local distribution systems, we wait. The utility industry can really only invest once a customer shows up and says, "Hey, I've got this load coming. Can you please, upgrade the grid for me? I'm coming with this charging load." If we would step back and consider, in its totality, how much load is coming when more fleets, 20%, 40%, 80%, we could do a better job up front, more cost-effective job of putting these solutions in place. And so I would encourage everyone to focus on sort of those big nuances about the trucking sector that are important. And this whole timing mismatch, I know that that's on top of mind for Volvo as well. The timing mismatch between the time it takes to get grid power to a site versus the time it takes to order a few semi-trucks. And I said in my testimony earlier, I can order a fleet of semi-electric trucks and they can be delivered in 4 to 6 months. And the grid upgrades probably can't be made in those same 4 to 6 months. So we've got to get we got to get ahead of this challenge.
Well, so this is the issue. I mean, Volvo is actually losing orders right now from people that want to, purchase these electric medium and heavy-duty trucks, but can't because of this issue of charging stations. So I hope we will, on a relatively urgent basis, move forward. I mean, this is the sort of chicken and the egg problem we've seen in other parts of this sector. I may have some questions to submit for the record, but I see my time is out. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Van Hollen, Senator Graham and I spoke earlier about trying to pull together some bipartisan technical recommendations for facilitating the transition in a whole variety of ways, things like supporting peak shaving, and this would be another good example. So look forward to working with you on that. And thank you very much for your interest. Now we turn to Senator Kennedy. So that's always what happens when a witness takes a long time.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome to all our witnesses. I'm sorry I was late. I was in another committee. How many of you drive an electric car, own an electric car? Okay. You gentlemen don't?
If you mean electric by a battery electric, no. If you mean plug-in electric, yes.
Okay. Of the three folks who raised their hands, how many do you own gasoline-powered cars at all? No?
No, Senator.
No, all electric. Okay. Let me ask you all this, and please give me brief answers, because there are 5 of you, and there's only 1 of me. Okay? If electric cars are so swell, how come we have to pay people to drive them?
The upfront costs of an electric vehicle are about $10,000 higher today than they are for an equivalent internal combustion
they're more
engine vehicle
expensive. Anything
today,
else?
but that cost is declining substantially.
Right.
And so this is a temporary intervention to help the auto industry strategically compete in global markets and to transition as battery
You didn't
costs
hear
fall.
my admonition, okay?
Sorry.
Doc, how about, if electric vehicles are so swell, how come we have to pay people to drive them?
I think sorry, Senator, I'll step
I'm
away
sorry,
from.
I can't see the names.
Oh, it's Gross, Ms. Gross here. I'll defer
Ma'am.
to not comment on policy questions about incentives and so on. Maybe
Tell
pass
me
it
your
off to
name. I
Ms.
can't
Hinman.
see your name tag.
Gross? I can switch.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry.
I can swivel it.
I apologize. Would you start over?
I was just going to say, I'd like to defer on policy grounds, not to talk about policy incentives and so on, defer over to my
Why not?
colleague here, Ms. Hinman.
You don't believe in electric cars?
Oh, totally support electric vehicles and drive 3 of them myself.
So if they're so swell, how come we're having to pay people to drive them?
So just speaking personally then, not representing my company at this point.
Sure.
Speaking personally.
Who's your company?
EPRI, the Electric Power Research Institute.
Oh, okay.
And I have to be careful about policy, stepping into, wading too deeply into policy as an independent leader here. But when we think about, again, I just want to ditto what Dr. Jenkins said. This is an effort to compete
Yes,
globally.
ma'am, I know all that, but how, if they're so swell, how come we have to pay people to drive them?
Well, maybe then the quick answer for me is I didn't take advantage of incentives, but I also bought used vehicles on the market. I love it. They're wonderful to drive. And so on.
Okay.
Senator, similar for myself, we
What's your
purchased.
name?
Maureen Hinman.
Damn.
My hair's longer in my picture, sorry.
I'm sorry, I don't even know who I'm talking to. Go ahead, Ms. Hinman.
I did want to follow up with my colleague, Ms. Gross. I purchased my first EV, fully
Yes,
electric.
ma'am, but
in
if they're so swell,
2015.
how come we have to pay people to drive them?
Well, I can only speak for myself, but we purchased our first vehicle in 2015 because it was easier to charge, cheaper to drive. It drives better, faster, smoother. There's no muck on the bottom of our garage. And frankly, when I had my first child, some of the safety features were just better.
But here's what I'm sorry, you're not answering my question. How many vehicles, how many cars do we have in the United States?
280.
This lady right here, in the middle. I'm sorry, if I could see your name, I wouldn't just point to you.
If I could, I'd like to defer to my colleague who
Well,
has
I'd like to
better.
hear your answer, okay?
How many calls?
How many cars are there?
295 million?
Okay, and what percentage are electric vehicles?
1.6.
Okay, hold up that chart. Here's where all electric vehicles are. California loves them. The West Coast loves them. Everybody else is kind of lukewarm. Okay, and I'm trying to understand why. But let me move on to this. Let me ask these 2 gentlemen. I think the reason is because they're more expensive. And people, when they drive a car, like it to run. And when it runs out of electricity, it stops. And they can't find a place to charge them. So let me ask these 2 gentlemen. I don't want to be unfair. So it's clear we got a long way to go. We got 283 million cars in America, and we got 3.3 million electric vehicles. We got a long way to go. And at least these 3 folks think that we need to take taxpayer money and give enough money to American people so they'll walk away from gas cars and drive electric vehicles. How much is that going to cost? I'm going to ask him in a second if I have time. But how much do you think it will cost for us to basically bribe every American to drive an electric car?
Well, Senator, excuse me, Dave Sweeter with the Alliance for Automotive Innovation. I would just underscore your original question with this. There's really two things at play as it relates to what's
How much
happening.
money do you think it'll cost
Costs
to
are
bribe the American people enough to make them drive electric cars, to move those numbers?
Electrification's increasing as it relates to cost. Only a fraction of currently eligible
How much do you
vehicles
think
are
it'll
eligible
cost?
for the federal tax credit. So
How much do you think it'll cost, David?
Senator, I think I quoted earlier
I'm
that
calling on you, sir.
Apologies.
How much do you think it'll cost?
it ultimately depends on
You
consumer
don't know,
adoption.
do you?
We don't have an exact figure.
You
no,
think we ought
Senator.
to just keep throwing money at it until we hit the jackpot? How about you, Mr. Davis?
Eventually, if you put enough charging stations there to solve for range anxiety, because the reason I didn't buy one is because I may have to drive 450
How
miles
much
to
do you
East
think
Tennessee
it'll
at spur of the moment.
cost the American taxpayer for us to convince the American people, frankly, bribe the American people to get rid of the gas car and drive an electric car? Can any of you give me a figure?
Yes, Senator, the Treasury Department reports we spent about $1 billion year to date, so for the first half of this year, so roughly $2 billion this
Well,
year.
we're behind.
As I noted,
How much do you think it'll cost, Doctor? You're a doctor,
so
right?
$2 billion this year is what the estimate from the Treasury
Okay,
Department.
How much do you think it will cost for us to, let's say, get 75% of these 200?
How much will it cost American consumers to remain,
How much, do you know how much it'll cost, Doctor?
no one knows the future with certainty, Senator.
Right, you just think we ought to keep throwing money at it until we hit the jackpot.
I think
Is
we
that
ought to
right?
set a stable policy framework that allows American consumers to become familiar with the environment and American businesses to innovate and to compete within that stable framework. That's what I said
And how
earlier in
much
my
will that
testimony.
cost?
Will cost less than the benefits delivered by
You
the
don't
policy.
care how much it costs, do you?
I care if the benefits exceed the costs. I don't care about the costs.
You
These are
don't care how
investments
much
in the
it
public.
costs, do you?
I care very much how much it costs. As long as the benefits exceed the costs, that's an investment worth making.
Well, so, okay.
How much
So-
does it cost to seed the industries of the future to China?
I get to ask the questions, Doc.
Sorry.
You're at Princeton, right?
That's correct.
Yeah. How are Jewish students doing at Princeton? Are they feeling better?
No, that has
more
nothing to do with the hearing today. I'm
I
not going
didn't
to
think
comment on
you'd
that.
I didn't think you'd want to talk about that. Do any of you have any idea how much it would cost
Senator,
to get, say, 75% of the American people
Senator,
driving electric cars?
if I could, your question is fair. One answer to it is the cost of inaction of the U.S. not competing is far greater than any incentive on the front
Okay,
end.
quantify that for me. Oh, man, I'm way over. I'm sorry, Sheldon. Quantify that for me, because here's my...
Once you wrap up with this, because I think
I will.
everybody's had a chance to try to
I will.
answer your question, and
Here's
you're
my
repeating
problem.
it at this
Okay,
point.
we all want clean air, we all want bright water, we all want to eat, and we all want to live indoors. Okay? But there are trade-offs in all of this. Despite what the Princeton professor thinks, we don't have unlimited money. This is not Princeton. So we have to decide the cost and the benefits. And nobody seems to be able to quantify the costs. They just say, keep throwing money at it, throwing money at it, throwing money at it. And nobody can really quantify the benefits, except if we don't do it, then we're all going to die. And when I go back to my people and say, your electricity costs have gone up 30%, but it's for a good cause. Why, Kennedy? Because you're going to die if we don't do it. Why, Kennedy? Because a professor at Princeton says so. That doesn't work for most Americans. Can you answer that for me? You see my frustration. I love driving an electric car. I think they're really cool. But the median household income in my state's $55,000. Our Princeton professor probably makes that in a week. Okay? They don't care what they think at Princeton. Can you answer that for me, guys?
I can't answer how much it's going
Good.
to cost, but I can tell you that just last year alone, China in the EV market subsidized it by $12.4 billion, and that's their annual spend. It's more than, even with in our best year, it's more than
And
two-thirds of the
China's
United
doing
States
great,
spends.
but let me ask you a question. How much will it cost China to become carbon neutral by 2050?
I am very concerned, well, they won't, but I'm more concerned about the
How much
risk
would it
to the
cost
U.S.
them?
economy of
How
losing
much
the
would
auto
it-
manufacturing industry.
How much would it cost them? Do you know? See, nobody talks about the cost. I'll tell you how much it'll cost them. It'll cost them $1 trillion a year, starting today, to be carbon neutral by 2050. You know how much it'll cost Russia? $250 billion a year, 3 times what their defense budget. Now, if you believe that Vladimir Putin is going to spend $250 billion for climate change, then you'll never own your own home. So we go spend all this money, which y'all can't quantify. We just keep spending. They don't spend the money. They're at an advantage, and you know how much world temperatures are lowered? None. 0, zilch, nada. And I can't believe our chairman hadn't cut me off. But I am done.
Now's your moment. Thank you,
I am
Senator
done.
Kennedy, for your enthusiastic participation in this hearing.
I just wish we had
Let
time
me,
to talk about all this. I think this is
wrap up.
fascinating.
With a couple of clarifications. First of all, the word mandate has come up repeatedly during this hearing, and I just want to make sure everybody understands there is no mandate. What there is a tax incentive. And for those of us who believe in traditional economic policy, what the tax incentive is there to do is to offset the negative externality of all of the pollution that comes out of an internal combustion engine that society at large pays for, but is not baked into the price of the vehicle. And you can go all the way to Milton Friedman to get the economic theory that supports that. Second, EVs have been more expensive than internal combustion engines, largely because of a market decision by the electronic vehicle innovators to come in at the high end of the market. Because Tesla, for instance, could compete with Maserati and Lamborghini on performance. And so, of course, they came in at the high end of the market, particularly when you're starting with small initial manufacturing runs. But as the market has grown, costs are now coming down to where it's maybe $1,000, $2,000 difference between the average EV cost and the average internal combustion engine cost, just around $50,000 in each case. There are available electronic vehicles that are less expensive than the average internal combustion engine now. So depending on what you want to choose, if you want to go and compete with Maseratis, you can go to the high end, but they're also cheaper than average internal combustion electric vehicle options. And the last thing I'll point out is that while tire emissions are obviously real, and tire emissions are greater from an electric vehicle than an internal combustion vehicle because the electric vehicle is A, heavier because of the battery, and B, higher performance because it's higher performance. So you have more tire wear, and that creates some additional measure of tire wear-related pollution. To complain about that in the context of tailpipe pollution and tailpipe emissions calls to mind the old biblical verse about the mote in your own eye, or the mote in your brother's eye compared to the beam in your own eye. The beam here is tailpipe emissions, which pollute enormously and create massive climate risk. And I agree that tire emissions need to be dealt with, but if you put them to scale and compare their hazard for humankind and for local health, it's mote versus beam. So with that, let me say that questions for the record are due by noon tomorrow, with signed hard copies delivered to the committee clerk in Dirksen 624. In particular, Ms. Gross and Dr. Jenkins, if you could even perhaps coordinate on recommendations for us in that peak shaving space. However you want to do it is fine, but I'd love to get those in. And we ask that our witnesses respond to those questions within 7 days of receipt, so that would be within a week if you guys could do that. With no further business for the committee, the vote on the floor has already begun, and our hearing is adjourned. Thank you.